So welcome to our final live presentation about the Tour du Mont Blanc, and thank you for joining us. This is Marvin to talk about how to get your best result on the day through a decent race plan. So as you know, this is a legendary tough event. It's often referred to as the toughest one-day sportive in the world. It covers 330 kilometers and includes 8,300 meters of climbing. These are pretty huge numbers and they command considerable respect. The start's at 5 a.m. and the cutoff time finishes midnight, so all finishers take somewhere between 12 and 19 hours. Every year about 40% don't finish, depending on the weather. It's really a challenge on three levels: mental, physical, and nutritional, and in that order. So the most likely reason to abandon is mental. To reach the finish, you're going to have to push yourself to your limits and then perhaps go beyond. You can expect to experience highs and lows with moments of euphoria followed by moments of despair. Neither of them last for very long. To paraphrase Rudyard Kipling, if you want to finish, you must treat those two imposters just the same. There are three essential things for a successful ride: pacing, especially on the climbs, fueling, and mental. I already said that mental is the most important, so I'll come to that one last. First, let me say a word about the importance of having a plan. You've probably heard this quote before from Benjamin Franklin. I don't think he was a cyclist, but his quote is still highly relevant. Those who fail to plan, plan to fail. So what should be in your plan? First, you need a plan for how you're going to taper so that you're in the best possible condition for the event. Next, for your travel and final preparations so that all goes smoothly without stress. And then, of course, for the event itself, in terms of pace, nutrition, hydration, clothing, and reminders of good technique for yourself. And finally, for how you're going to actually remember this during the event. It's useless having a plan if you can't remember it and can't apply it. So we'll look at all of those things during the course of the next half an hour or so. Let's look at planning your taper first. There's now roughly 2 weeks to go until July the 13th, a bit less actually. Your goal should be to eliminate all fatigue before you get to the start line. It's not an exaggeration to say that you can throw away a lot of the benefits of your training if you don't get these last few days right. So first of all, progressively reduce your training volume by at least half. Limit the intensity. I would say essentially to zero intensity. If you must do some, keep it short and sweet. And above all, sleep well, eat well, stay supple, limit the stress in your life, and limit any extra demands on you to the extent possible. It's worth knowing that full recovery is much more valuable than 95% of recovery. At 95%, you could easily lose 20% of your performance potential over the last 2 climbs. So that can be really handicapping. So aim at 100% recovery without, of course, losing fitness. The next part of your planning concerns your travel and final preparations leading up to the start. This is mostly common sense, but it's much better to think it through and plan it out in advance so that you don't get caught up in a last-minute planning. So the first thing is to plan to get plenty of sleep the last few days, because you won't get much the night before the event. Plan your travel carefully, confirm your accommodation, plan your evening meal. You might want to bring your own food for your evening meal rather than relying on a restaurant. When you're ready to start packing, it's a good idea to use a checklist for your kit so you don't forget anything. And finally, pack your bike at least 1 day in advance to avoid last-minute problems. If you'd like a copy of our checklist, send me an email at info@alpinecols.com and I'll be happy to send you a copy of the checklist that you can see on the screen then. So now coming to pacing, we need to talk first about your objective. What's your objective for the event? If your goal is to get a fast time, then you must ride as close as possible to your limits, but without ever going over them. Be careful, however, because whereas on a normal sportive, the consequences of going over your limits are not too serious, on the Tour du Mont Blanc, it will probably mean you can't finish. So you need to figure out what pace you can sustain over the full 157 kilometers of climbing. I'll show you how to do that in a couple of minutes. If your goal is just to finish before the cutoff, to be an official finisher, in other words, then you need to work backwards from the official cutoff times at on the Cormet de Roselaine and at Bourg Saint-Maurice and at Les Vallettes, and make sure you get there in time. So you need to be at Les Vallettes by 11 o'clock to beat the cutoff. I calculate, nevertheless, that to stand a good chance of making all of the cutoffs, you should actually reach the feed station at Les Vallettes well before 11 o'clock. You should be there by 9:45. So this is at the foot of the climb to the Col de Champex. So that means an average speed for the first 110 kilometers of 23 kilometers an hour. You then need to be on top of the Grand Saint-Bernard by 1:45. Now it's important to recognize that if your only goal is to finish, it makes little sense to try to beat these time limits by a large margin, particularly if that means pushing harder than you're comfortable with. The risk is that you go too hard too early and then you're unable to finish. So it's better to hold back and get through these the gates, if you will, within the time limits. And then you can finish relatively strong if you've gone relatively easy at the beginning. Much better to do a negative split in that way. So how do you know which pace is sustainable for you for 157 kilometers of climbing? Well, it comes from evidence and not from hope. Do not base your plan on hope. That's a really key piece of advice. Miracles don't happen very often, and it's unlikely that you'll be much stronger at the Tour du Mont Blanc than you were in your training or at other events. So what evidence can you use to determine your pace? The best data comes from your power meter if you have one. If you don't have a power meter, you can use VAM, which is vertical speed in elevation meters per hour, which in the absence of wind and at speeds below about 15 kilometers per hour, so there's not too much wind resistance, is very closely related to power. You can find this data on Strava after your ride, or you can see it in real time if you add VAM, and especially lap VAM, to your bike computer. So I strongly recommend doing that. And in order to find the VAM that you should be targeting, you want to look for the longest possible climbs on your longest training days and see what you did. In the examples here, I took the last 3 climbs on the Tour du Mont Blanc. So I did these 3 climbs respectively at VAMs of 582, 644, and 685 meters per hour. These precise numbers aren't important, of course. You need to find your own. Now, as well as power and VAM, you can, of course, also use heart rate as an indicator. Heart rate measures how your body is reacting to the load, but it's less reliable than power VAM because it's influenced by many other factors than just the intensity, such as stress, temperature, caffeine, dehydration, and so on. It's still a useful indicator, but it's not as easy as power to interpret. Finally, some people are sufficiently in tune with their feelings to get a good result just by feeling the effort. To get this right takes a lot of experience. Okay, let's come back to power and see how you can use the evidence of your past performance to plan your pacing at the TMB. Now, the place to start is your power duration curve and your critical power, or FDP. They're not the same thing, but they're essentially the same number at the end of the day. We get to them by different routes, but it's the same number. So here's a personal example from 2022 when I was planning to ride the Tour du Mont Blanc that year. My critical power at the time was about 275 watts. So in theory, I would have been able to hold this for 50, 60 minutes. However, this is nowhere near enough time to get up any of the long times on the Tour du Mont Blanc. And in any case, I wouldn't be able to repeat it over and over again. So I had to look at other evidence to see what fraction of that number I might be able to climb at for 10 hours or more. So here's what I'd done in previous long distance events with a lot of climbing, such as Liège-Bastogne-Liège, the Mallorca 312, some Sanglé rides on Mont Ventoux, the Marmot, the Cols Challenge in Corsica, and of course the Tour du Mont Blanc itself, which I rode in the previous year in 2021 over 2 days. So these gave me real life data for the average power I was able to sustain on the climbs during these events. To make it relevant for you, you should pay more attention to the percentage of critical power FTP than to the actual power numbers. Note that the climbs on Liège-Bastogne-Liège are all short, and the climbs on the Mallorca 312 are mostly in the first half of the course, which explains why the percent of critical power is relatively high at those events compared to the others. The most useful data is, in fact, is the last two, the Cols Corsica and the Tour du Mont Blanc in 2 days. The problem is that it's still a big step up and a leap into the unknown to go from a half Tour du Mont Blanc to the full Tour du Mont Blanc distance. So I therefore plan to be conservative and target 60% of my critical power on the climbs. In terms of zones, this was towards the bottom of my zone 2. So unless you're very strong, don't even think of going into zone 3 on the Tour du Mont Blanc. So that's how to determine your pace. Look at your own data, search out evidence for what you've actually done, and then make a call on what you think you can do at the event. Now, what if it's very hot? The hotter it is, the less power you can produce at a given intensity. A 2021 study showed that the reduction in power at 35 degrees can be as high as 17%. It's between 10 and 17%. Therefore, when it's very hot, don't look at power, but look at your heart rate data. You use your heart rate zones rather than your power zones, and stick to a heart rate target for the desired intensity. What's going to happen is, because of the heat, your heart rate's going to be a little bit higher, but that's a better indicator than power. So, of course, you're using the heart rate that you've determined on one or more rides at normal temperatures. So again, if it's very hot, use heart rate as a rather than power, or at least accept you're going to be at least 10% down on your power number, and perhaps more, perhaps as much as 15 or 15% down. Okay, so yeah, sorry, the hotter it is, the less power you can produce at a given intensity. Target heart rate. Forgot to click those up. Now, while we're on the subject of heat, there's a fair chance it'll still be a heat wave at the event. So there are 2 challenges when cycling for many hours in very hot weather. The first is avoiding dehydration, and the second is preventing your body from overheating. For both, it's really important to listen to your body and be attentive to how you feel. If you feel unusually tired, if you've got a headache, if you feel weak, or if your heart rate is unusually high, you may be suffering from dehydration or heat stroke. So be careful. If that's the case, much better to stop, call it a day, or at the very least to stop for a while and bring your body temperature down. So avoiding dehydration. Unfortunately, the answer to this, or the solution to this, isn't as simple as drinking enough water. If you drink too much plain water while sweating heavily, you risk hypernatremia, which is a life-threatening condition due to lack of salts in your blood. So following a death from hypernatremia at the 2002 Boston Marathon, the experts now recommend drinking mostly a neutral electrolyte mix with enough total fluid intake so that you need to urinate occasionally. If you're not getting off the bike to have a pee every now and again, if you reach the halfway point and you haven't needed to urinate, that's a problem. Okay, or if you go from the halfway point to the end, that's a problem. So make sure you're drinking enough so that you do need to stop. Make sure that you never feel thirsty, and make sure that your heart rate is not abnormally high. So that's avoiding dehydration. Avoiding overheating. The key is to keep the intensity down. The harder you're riding, the more heat your body is generating. So therefore, the bigger the risk of overheating. Stay as much as possible in the shade. I know that's easier said than done. If the shade's on the wrong side of the road, it may be too dangerous to cross the road, but you do what you can. Stop if necessary, to cool down. Don't hesitate to stop. Your health is at stake here. Keep spraying yourself with water. You obviously want two large water bottles with you. One of them, just keep pouring it over your head and your legs. That's the most important places to cool down. And stop and use water fountain. There are plenty of public water fountains on the route. Stop at those or stop at streams to cool off in. Okay, so do take, if it's very, very hot, you've got to take this seriously. Here's a good illustration from our last training camp, the Étape du Tour camp. It was well over 30 degrees, so we all needed to do this. Now let's look at fueling. Whether you get this right or wrong will have a massive effect on your performance. So the first point is you need to start with a full tank of glycogen in your muscles. You do this by carb loading, but there's no need to be obsessive about it. Just eat an extra serving of carbs per meal on the Wednesday and the Thursday before the event, and then eat normally on Friday. Remember to compensate for the extra calories by eating less fat, so cut down on butter, oil, cheese, fatty meats, and so on. And if you're eating a lot of pasta, go easy on the olive oil and the parmesan. During the event, you're going to burn somewhere in the region of 8,000 to 10,000 calories. There's no way to eat this much during the event. As a simple calculation will show you, a bar contains between 100 and 200 calories, so you need to eat at least 50 of them. So it's therefore essential to start with a full tank. I've already mentioned carb loading in the last 3 days. Now you need an early, well-digested, carb-heavy breakfast. So this means going to bed early and then waking up in the middle of the night to eat. 3 hours, 2 hours, and then again 1 hour before the start. E.g. something like white rice and omelette at 2 a.m., gingerbread or cake at 3 a.m., honey waffles at 4 a.m., just as an example. At this stage, having food inside you is more important than sleep, which is why I mentioned earlier it's important to get plenty of sleep in the nights before and to arrive without stress. An additional benefit of eating a couple of times or 3 times through the night is you'll have digested it and you're much more likely to be able to go to the toilet before you go to the start line at 5 o'clock. Which is a definite advantage. You don't want to have to stop somewhere and go and beg a cafe or a hotel or somewhere to let you use the toilet. So the amount you need to consume during the ride itself depends on how good a fat burner you are and how hard you're riding. But that said, it's generally the answer is the more the better. Hopefully you've been training for this over the past 6 or 12 months. The current recommendations are to consume a minimum of 60 grams and up to 100 or even 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour. The actual amount that you will be able to consume depends on what you're used to doing in training. You won't be able to increase it dramatically on the day, but I do strongly recommend that you see 60 grams per hour as the absolute minimum. You can see here the amount of carbs in a bottle of energy drink, a gel, an energy bar, or a banana. They're all roughly around 30. So it means you want to aim at 2 to 4 items per hour, minimum of 2. What's really important is never drop behind, never skip a feed, because you cannot catch up again. Okay, here are a few more tips for fueling at during the event. The first is to carry as much as possible with you from the start. That's for 2 reasons. One, if you know what you've got, you won't be surprised by something which doesn't agree with you. And 2, you save an awful lot of time by only needing to pick up water when you stop at the feed station. Second point, test everything in advance. Don't try something, don't pick up something that looks good the day before and try it at the event, because if it doesn't work for you, which is often the case with gels, perhaps a bit less of solid food, but you never know. That's a real problem. So test everything in advance. Avoid dry and crumbly bars because the crumbs tend to stick in your throat and can easily go down the wrong way. Pre-open the wrappers to make it easy to access. You don't want to be fumbling around in there with two hands on a steep slope. And finally, eat little and often, at least every 15 minutes rather than once per hour. Eat even every 5 or 10 minutes, just something, one bite or something, just to keep it coming in. Here's the full list of the feed stations with the details of what's usually available. At the first two, there's fruit. There's usually bananas and oranges with biscuits and energy bars. And then at the following stations, they add things like salty things like salami, cheese, bread, and pasta. Now, I strongly recommend you stop briefly at every feed station, but bear in mind that if you stop for 5 minutes, that will add up to 5 times 7 equals 35 minutes. So if there's any risk of missing the cutoffs, keep your stops as short and as efficient as possible. You should probably only stop very briefly for water at the first feed station at 54 kilometers, for example, at least. Okay, so that's it for nutrition. Now let's take a look at the mental side. Remember I said at the start that the biggest challenge on the Tour du Mont Blanc is mental. So long as you've done the training and you eat and drink enough, the most likely reason to abandon is mental. And this is because for most people, this will be the longest, toughest day they've ever spent on the bike, and by a significant margin. If you've done the Marmot before, that's a really hard ride. And many people finish, every time I finish the Marmot, I tell myself, never again. And yet at the end of the Marmot, you're only just over halfway to the Tour du Mont Blanc. So what can you do to prepare mentally for this? So this quote is from one of the world's top experts in the mental side of endurance sports, and it perfectly encapsulates the challenge. Endurance is the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop. I can practically guarantee that by the time you get to the Cormier de Roselend, you'll be experiencing a mounting desire to stop. You may already feel this on the Petit Saint-Bernard. I think most people do. So what can you do about it? Well, there are two ways to increase your mental strength and your ability to continue against this famous mounting desire to stop. The first is to increase your motivation, and the second is to reduce your perception of the effort. And in fact, you want to do both of them in parallel. This is a complicated subject. We don't have time to go into in detail, but you can find more if you go onto our website. Under the blog section, I've got a whole piece on which develops this in much more detail on the mental side of cycling. So how do you increase your motivation? The first point is to have a good answer to the question, why am I doing this? You can be sure you're going to ask this question several times. For me, in the example here, I wanted to prove to myself that I could do the full distance on the Mallorca 312. The second point is to have a clear set of goals. And the first type of goal is an outcome goal, something like to finish or to finish in less than 15 hours. The key is to make sure it's realistic and achievable. Okay, there's no point in setting yourself up with a goal that you're going to really struggle to achieve. My only outcome goal at the Mallorca 312 was to finish. Then there's a second category of goals called process goals, which are things that will help you achieve the outcome. So these are actually the most important goals. They're things like stick to the plan, climb at 60% of my FTP, eat 60 grams of carbohydrates every hour, and similar things. So those three were my goals on the Mallorca 312, and they enable me to have a very good ride. Now, still on the motivational side, when you go through a rough patch, you may find some positive self-talk to be helpful. It's really important to be able to counter that seductive voice in your head that says something like, damn, this is too hard. I'm not going to make it. Let's just stop here. Why go on? Come on, give yourself a break. That's really seductive, right? So you've got to be able to combat that voice in your head or that little devil on your shoulder. Different things work for different people, so choose and adapt what works for you. Some examples. This is what I've been training for. I'm not going to give up now. I'm so lucky to be here. Let's enjoy it. Other people can't be here. because they just can't do it. They're physically incapable, or there are other reasons why they can't be here. Um, and so I'm lucky. Let's make the most of it. You might just tell yourself to keep pushing, keep pushing. You might tell yourself, well, the others are hurting even more than I am, so I can keep going. You might say, well, look how far I've come. I've come this far. I can get to the end. However, taking the event as a whole can be absolutely overwhelming. So it can be very helpful to break down the event into sections, climb by climb. When things get really bad, I can get to the top of this climb, or even I can just get to the next corner. And then when you get to the next corner, surprise, surprise, you've still got enough energy to get to the next corner after that. And little by little, you haul yourself the way up the slope, and then finally you arrive on the summit. Now, another category of positive self-talk is instructional, where you tell yourself what to do. Examples might be stick to your own pace. Don't hang on to that wheel. It's going too fast for you. Pedal smoothly. That's important to avoid wasting energy. Relax your shoulders. Again, important to avoid wasting energy. When you're descending, look far ahead or look for the vanishing point. And last but not least, visualization can be helpful. Seeing yourself at the summit of the current climb, or even seeing yourself at the finish, can be a powerful motivator and a reason to keep going. Now let's talk about how to reduce the feeling of effort. This is important because the easier it feels, the longer you can keep going. In fact, that's how the brain tells you to slow down, is it feels harder and harder. Okay, so we need to combat that and find ways to make it feel less and less hard. Now, one of the best ways to do that is to distract your mind from the feeling, which basically means thinking about something else. So here are a few examples of how to do that. Relive a memory. Take yourself elsewhere, in other words. Think about your future plans. Enjoy the scenery. Focus intently on the rider just in front. Count pedal strokes, maybe in another language, to make it a little bit more of a mental effort, and therefore to forget the physical effort. Try reciting poetry, song lyrics, or mantras. Or if all else fails, just let your mind go blank. It's sort of mindfulness motivation, and think of nothing at all. All of those work for me. Here are several more tips you can use for reducing your perception of the effort. Smile. It's not a joke. It really works because it releases endorphins and makes you feel better. Even if you don't feel like smiling, just force your mouth into a smile and it will release some endorphins. Relax, especially your upper body and your shoulders. We get very, very tense in the shoulders and upper body as we're climbing. So keep relaxing it. Take a caffeine gel because the caffeine has an effect on reducing the perception of effort as well. Have a lucky charm with you if you have one. If you believe in a lucky charm, then it works. And of course, self-talk once again, which you can use in this context so it doesn't feel so bad. If the weather is bad on particularly on the highest point on the Grand Saint-Bernard, if it's raining, it can be extremely cold on the descent. So tell yourself, there's no point in lying to yourself. It is cold, sure. Okay, but even though it's cold, I'm not feeling uncomfortable. I can handle this. And then on another occasion, when you're climbing, you might say, tidy yourself up, pedal smoothly. So all of these things can help reduce perceived effort. Now, the final part of mental preparation is contingency planning. A lot of things could go wrong on your ride, but there's no reason why they should stop you finishing, make you stressed and waste time trying to sort something out that if you're calm and prepared for it, you can sort it out very quickly, so long as you've got a decent plan. So just quickly, things that happen: punctures, bad weather, heat, you getting dropped when you don't expect to be, bonking, feeling sick, you might get cramps, you might be feeling dispirited. All of these things can happen and more. So think through them. What am I going to do if this happens? and just have a little plan ready for it. You'll find more on this sort of stuff in our mental preparation guide, which is again, in our blog on the Alpine Cols website, and I'm pretty sure it's still on the Tour du Mont Blanc website as well. I forgot to check earlier. Now, a word about clothing and personal equipment. Having inadequate clothing for the conditions is probably the fourth major reason for abandoning. Okay, if it's a heat wave, you're probably not going to need anything more than your summer kit. But if it isn't, beware and be prepared. It obviously all depends on the weather. It's essential to have a good understanding of the forecast around the whole course, and especially on the highest cols. Chances are if it's anything other than a heat wave, you will need more than a simple jersey. So don't forget you start at 5 o'clock in the morning with a long descent from the Col des Saisies. So that in itself can be extremely cold. So the best solution is thin layers that are easily adaptable. Things like arm warmers, light rain jacket, light gilet, perhaps long gloves, cap or bonnet, neck warmer, leg warmers. It depends what the forecast says. So that's why it's really important to be sure about the forecast. Now the question then is, how on earth do I carry all of this stuff? The thing is, this event is far more like an ultra event than a normal sportive. So don't be shy about using a saddlebag or a frame bag for bike packing. If you're only concerned about the start, you could wear a very cheap plastic jacket you can jump in a bin at the bottom. I've seen that done before. One other option is to tie things around your waist or stuff them down your jersey. So there you go. Yeah, if you wear two jerseys, you've got 6 pockets. That's an old tip for things like this as well. Okay, so the key is it all depends on the weather. Now let's bring all this together in a plan. Remember that failing to plan is planning to fail. So in this chart here, I've worked out estimated times to arrive at each feed station based upon 2 target ride times. 16 hours, so it's a good average time, or just inside the time limit at 19 hours. Okay, over 19 hours, you're going to be out of time, so you won't be a finisher. In the first case, for example, if you're aiming at 16 hours, you need to be on the Col de Grand Saint-Bernard at 12:30. Whereas in the second case, you only need to be there by 13:43, let's say 1:45. The respective power numbers for 16 hours and 19 hours are 2.7 and 2.2 watts per kilo, and the VAMs are 755 and 605 vertical meters per hour, calculated, of course, in both cases on the climbing sections only. I've taken a fairly conservative descending speed to allow a bit of margin and a little bit of time stopped at the feed station. So I think those numbers are pretty accurate. In other words, if you weigh 70 kilos, you should be able to finish if you average all the climbs at 154 watts. That's based upon the 2.2 watts per kilo. And if you weigh 80 kilos, you'll need to average 176 watts to finish. Okay, so obviously work those numbers out for yourself. The times I think are good. Depending on what time you're targeting, you'll need to adjust them. Or rather than, I shouldn't say what time you're targeting, what time you think is realistic given your current ability. So here's an example plan to finish in 16 hours. The key parts of the plan include pace. So I would say something like ride my own pace from start to finish, make all the climbs in low zone 2 at 2.7 watts per kilo, VAM 750. So this is for 16 hours. If anything left, increase progressively on the final climb. And above all, there's a lot of descending. There's obviously as much descending as there is climbing. So descend fast but safely. Maintain concentration on all the descents. From the nutrition standpoint, consume a minimum of 60 grams of carbs from start to finish with something every 15 minutes. Stop at all the feed stations, but for the least time possible. Drink at least half a bottle per hour, plus electrolytes, more if it's going to be very hot. Electrolytes, you can either stick them in the bottle, or what I prefer to do is I take electrolyte pills that I can just swallow. That means I can have just plain clean water in the bottle. So see, I much prefer pouring clean water on my head than electrolytes or energy drink. Next part of the plan is mental, so be mentally prepared for 2 or 3 rough patches, and obviously that plan could be further developed with the positive self-talk you're planning to use and how you're going to deal with when it feels too hard. And finally, clothing, carry layers for all likely weather. So finally, of course, planning is not enough. You also need to be able to stick to the plan. Really, and it's pointless to plan and then not stick to it. So how do you do that? How on earth are you going to remember it? Well, here we can take a leaf out of the pros book or learn from them. This is Mathieu van der Poel's nutrition sticker from the Tour of Flanders 2 or 3 years ago. The plan for him was to consume upwards of 100 grams of carbs per hour for the 272 kilometers of the Tour of Flanders. On that chart, there's a code. So the circles are rice cakes, the rectangles are energy bars. The icons that look a bit like gels are, of course, gels, and the bottle icons are bottles of energy drink. So you can copy this idea, create something similar for yourself, paste it on your stem, and then that will help you remember. To finish, here are what I think are the top 5 mistakes to avoid. The first is going too hard on the early climbs. If you push too hard on those early climbs, you're just going to go too deep, and you'll have nothing left for the last couple of climbs. The second one is to burn too many or even any matches at all. I strongly recommend you don't do any high intensity. Don't go more than 5 watts above your target wattage. That's a slight exaggeration, but certainly no more than 10, 15 watts above your target wattage, and immediately bring it back. The worst thing you can do is you start as if imagine you're on a club ride and you make an effort to get back on someone's wheel. Don't do that. That's very likely to create trouble for you much later in the ride, and it may even cost you your ability to finish. No matches, low, steady intensity all the way. Third one is to fall behind in terms of eating and drinking, to forget, in other words, to eat and drink. So you can set an alarm to ping every 10 or 15 minutes on your Garmin. That's quite a good way. I find if I don't do that, I tend to forget. And suddenly 20 minutes has gone by and I haven't eaten or drunk anything. So that's a good idea. The fourth is inadequate clothing. Or perhaps on if it's a heat wave and there's baking sun all day, then of course sun cream, really crucial to lather up, and maybe even bring a tube with you to put more on after you've been in the sun for 7 or 8 hours already. And then finally, taking silly risks when descending. It's amazing how many accidents there are on the descent on these type of events, and they're due to people getting tired and just becoming a little bit blasé and forgetting how dangerous descending in the Alps is. So back off, take it easy, don't take any silly risks, and it's not worth trying to gain 2 minutes on a descent and then throwing it all away with an accident. Okay, so with that, I've reached the end of the presentation. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention. So for now, this is me saying thanks for listening. Stay safe and good luck.